The past lessons, we've been in the book of Daniel trying to take a look at that book and try to look at the way that we have God's people that were taken off as a result of their own sin in Judah and being taken into captivity and living in a very ungodly world, a nation. And there's a lot of similarities, and that's what I've been really trying to bring to our lessons, is to try to look at the parallel between us living, even though we live in a great nation. Don't get me wrong. We have never, in the history of the existence of humans, had such a nation where we as Christians could have the freedoms that we have and that we can choose. It's a little echoey, Suzanne. Could you turn it down just a tad? And that's what we forget about, because I know everybody in this room here, have the experience of being in America, in a nation like this, versus, you think about it, up until the founding of this nation, it was a king, it was a monarch, it was an emperor, it was a dictator. From the beginning of time, that's all that God's people ever knew. And we whine, as Americans, oh, it's so bad, it's so bad. And I'm like, be quiet. You ought to really take a look at history and realize the blessing that we have in this country. So I talk bad about it and I'll preach things about it, but I'll tell you, the only bad part about it, I think, is that it's made Christians lazy. It's made us lazy. Get along, and we just kind of like, everybody do their own thing, and for the longest time, and then now we're pushing out the entire concept that this nation was founded, whether people like it or not, on Christian values. That's a fact. You can gaslight that all you want, but that's a fact. And until they go to the Supreme Court and chisel off Moses' statue, and they go into the House of Representatives and start stripping out all the things that are religious, it's going to be in our face. It's there. That's a blessing beyond. So that's why I blame us. In a lot of ways, we have allowed this nation to get into where it's at as Christians. We've allowed this slippery slope. And people used to kind of mock me and joke at me because I would say things, like the comedy Three's Company with John Ritter. And I said that was one of the starting points in the 70s. That show was hilarious. I watched it. John Ritter is hilarious. But did you know what they were teaching? Did you pick up on the little thing? Okay. Let's go back to Ozzie and Harriet. Remember them? If you didn't, Google it. It's there. It's back in The Perfect Family, the utopic family. And I was a little delusional, I get it. But back then, did you know that whenever they filmed the bedroom scene for Ozzie and Harriet, that the parents were in twin beds? Did you know that was a part of the filming conditions, the moral standards in Hollywood? Yeah, I laughed too. Whoa, have we come a long way, right? I mean, and there was a thing in the contract too, the moral code, that the actor and actress, if they were in that twin bed in the room, that they had to have 1 foot on the floor when they were laying down in the bed and acting. What happened? So that's what I mean. That's a starting point. Now, I'm not saying it was, it depicted kind of a dream state family. Man, that really, look at where we're at now in our movies. I mean, they're honestly pornographic. They are. And we have had this ability in this nation as Christians to stand up, and we haven't. We've just let it slide. So we're reaping the fruits of our own bad behavior, the generations even before us, my grandfather and other ones that have not stood up, and we are not standing up. And now we're paying for the price, and now we're living in a very ungodly nation. It's horrible out there. And it's even worse. I feel bad. I thought my grandfather looked at me and felt bad. Now I'm looking at my grandchildren, and it's not even the same. And so how do we deal with that? How do we look at that? How do we endure that and still be right with God? And that's what these series of lessons have been. And we looked at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, and how that when they first came in and under captivity, that it would have been so easy for them to just conform and eat the food there. I mean, if all you got is McDonald's in the town, you eat at McDonald's, right? And it was like them saying, no, we're not going to do it because it's going to violate what God wants. How many of us would say, well, okay, we'll just eat at McDonald's. There's no other option. But that's the journey we saw with these young men. And as those lessons we went through, the conflict that occurred where then the people who were around them saw how good they were and started attacking them. And they didn't bow down, did they? Literally. They would not bow down. And they're living under these kings that are worshiping these very, and I mean ungodly, I mean devilish gods and the sacrifices that they were doing. And they were having to live under that type of a government. So no matter how bad we complain about our government, I want us to remember it could be a lot worse. The beauty is we do have a choice. We can help that. And that's where we need to stand up for God's moral values. And we need to do that. But going back to this idea, they were able to do it. You can too. It's not that they're better than you. It's not. You know, those young men, remember, they came into captivity at 15 years old. And they held fast to that. And no matter if they threw him in a lion's den or they put a statue up to try to trick Daniel so that they'd have to, kill him, or throw him into a fiery furnace. Who's had that problem? None of us. And we collapse under little pressure, don't we? We just crumble. We won't say anything. We'll adapt to it so we don't have conflict in fear of the world more than we fear God. Or somehow maybe we think we're not valuable enough, and so we think, well, God's not going to protect me. I mean, who am I? Daniel, Meshach, yeah, throw him in the lion's den. I get it. They deserve to be rescued, but me, we feel that way. And we need to get that out of our heads. We really do. That's why he didn't write these stories so we could look at them some 3,000 years later and go, wow, that's really cool, but it ain't me. It's not, it's not some fantasy book like Game of Thrones or something where you can look at it and go, wow. No, it is you and me. That's what he's trying to tell us. He's also not only telling us individually how we can stand up and endure and survive this, but he's also helping us to understand in this book of Daniel what he's doing on the bigger picture that we don't get. That we look around the world and we look at a Hitler, a Stalin, a Khmer Rouge. We look at, some corrupt and evil people, dictators down. Idi Amin, I talked about, some people that are just vicious and vile. And you go, God, what are you doing? How could you do this? And that's exactly what the prophets cried out to God at times. And then when God would say, you know what? I'm going to take the Assyrians and I'm going to punish Israel. And Habakkuk talked back to God. He did. He talked back. He goes, whoa, I've been praying that they get punished, but the Assyrians, are you serious? They are the most despicable culture. We're going to talk about that this afternoon in the book of Nahum, the prophet of Nahum. They were bad. They were, barbaric is a compliment to the Assyrians. And Habakkuk balked at God. And God said, hold on there. Because as soon as they show disrespect and they defile, then guess what? Judgment's coming on them. And that's what we see. That's what we see in the minor prophets. That's what we see historically. We see it confirmed again and again on those little cuneiforms. Archaeology is showing it and confirming even the book of Daniel. That what Daniel wrote supports the historical records of these kings and the king of Babylon and Persia. And so I'm here to tell you, God is alive and well, and he's operating the exact same way he did with those nations back then. He's doing it today. We just are not on his clock, you know. We're expecting things faster. And so, but we need to understand that and keep that in our minds when we see things going on around us in our government and around the world, some of the things happening. Just keep that in mind. You see, that's how you start to achieve that peace that goes beyond understanding. Because when you can have the confidence in knowing, yeah, there's a really ugly dictator out there in the world that's mutilating people, and you just go, you know what? God's got it. God's got it. You think God's not watching? That's the lessons, these last two. Last time we looked at Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years, one of the greatest empires that existed. Now, Cyrus the Great comes along, and his empire is probably a little better known, but even God said through prophets, through Daniel, that Nebuchadnezzar, but the Babylonian kingdom was amazing, one of the greatest there was. But Nebuchadnezzar also worshiped false gods, and he had flip-flopped. We've already looked at the way that, one moment he's perplexed, and God's, trying to get a message to him, and he can't understand what's going on. And what does he do? He calls in all of his intelligente, I would say, the astronomers, astrologers, chanters. Explain this dream to me. Explain this to me. And they're like, blah, 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 blah. We don't know. And then they bring in who? Daniel. So Daniel comes in at the age of 15, and we see him accelerate because of who? Because of God. Even though he's in that horrible situation, that environment, he is still being accelerated and elevated and honored. And whether no matter how many people hate him, they can't touch him. They can't. Remember Darius? Darius even respected him. So we get on, and we see this over and over again at the national level, that God is sending messages to these leaders. He's doing it to this day. I don't know how. I have no idea. But I do have confidence that he is talking to them. He is sending them messages to where they will have no excuse. And that's what he did with Nebuchadnezzar. Last week we looked at that where, he had that dream about a tree and this all happening, and the tree gets chopped down and the animals get scattered. And, Daniel comes in and says, you know what? God has given you one of the greatest kingdoms there is. And because you lack this humility, he's going to make you like a madman and drive you away and take your kingdom away. But until you humble yourself, and when you do, God will restore you. And like I said, even historically, it's written in some cuneiforms that there was a period of time that Nebuchadnezzar, they didn't say he went crazy and stuff because, they're not going to say that, but it does say he started to fail to rule the empire. He just stopped. Something happened. And then Nebuchadnezzar, remember, he wrote that chapter in Daniel. He's the one that wrote it and proclaimed God being great and the only God. He wrote that chapter so that what? Everybody living would know. And then he turned right back. Unfortunately, he lived another 2 years, but he still ruled 43 years, the longest ruler of Babylon. Then we have a turnover, like everything happens, who's going to take over. And there's still to this day, because of course you're never going to say that you killed the right person who should be ruling, and so you get your big historical eraser out and you erase the brother that you killed that should have probably been ruling. So there's some ambiguity about the succession of the king after Nebuchadnezzar. But we finally come to one point in history. We're around 539. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah in 609 and took over. God said 70 years that they would sit in captivity. We're bumping right up against it. Nebuchadnezzar dies. And then through some rapid successions of some that said they were entitled to the throne. But then we get to one who, through some weird connections of family, proclaims he is the heir or rightful ruler, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he's a weirdo because he takes off and he goes off and does this little thing archaeological. He just turns over the kingdom. He really doesn't want to rule, but then he puts his son in to rule. And so I'm telling you this because the confusion about the lineage of who's king and was they really descendants of Nebuchadnezzar is in question. So you're going to hear the phrase when he says, my father, and then even Daniel will say, your father Nebuchadnezzar, is very similar to the same phrase that we hear that people would say, my father Abraham. You know, even though he wasn't really your father, he was your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. The Jews to this day, what do they call him? Father Abraham. So that's one of the reasons I'm saying that. The other reason is because he's going to offer whoever can interpret this sign, third ruler of the kingdom. Third. That's because daddy's off on his little whatever trip. And so he's put him to rule as chief prince. And then he's going to offer whoever can interpret this vision he has as third ruler. Now, what's happening historically is important too. God had prophesied through Isaiah and other prophets that 70-year window, it's coming down. It's right now where we're going to start in this story, it's upon them. Now, he had also said, by proper name through the prophets, that a king, Cyrus, would arise and that he would be the one that would set them free. And he even tells Daniel in his prophecy that from the proclamation going forward, how long before the actual Son of God comes? So we have a name. He's the only worldly king that's ever prophesied about by proper name. So what's going on? You have Babylon has conquered Syria. We're way beyond that. Syria is gone. Babylon's been ruling Nebuchadnezzar for 43 years. We're about 60 years in, 65 years or so. And we have these puppet rulers coming along. And then we have the Persians sitting over towards Iran. In that area there, they're not quite called that. Well, they're being in subjection to another rule. There's some fighting going on. This guy, Cyrus, rises up and rebels against some of the people over him. He consolidates and he's growing in power. And as he's growing in power, daddy's off doing his little thing in the desert. And his son, party boy, is just doing his thing and not paying attention to what's going on in the world stage. And so it sets this story up about, again, it's exactly the same. And this is what Daniel's going to tell him. This is the same thing that your granddaddy went through. It's this idea of pride and arrogance. And we see that in leaders all the time. Pride and arrogance. And ignoring what God has given them a lesson about. And that's what we're going to pick up. And so what happens, and this happened within a week of this vision, this story in Daniel. Cyrus the Great conquers and defeats them at Opus. He defeats the Babylonian army. And he is en route to Babylon. And guess what does the son do? Throws a party. You see, these leaders, and I'm saying that present, future, and in the past, grow so secure in themselves and the technology around them, they start to believe they're invincible. They ignore the facts. God has already been warning them. And so when that divisive battle, he's lost it, and they're in retreat, he decides, Belshazzar, to have a party. And that's the delusion that sometimes we see our leaders, and that's where we pick it up now, and we go into chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of 1,000. Belshazzar, when he had tasted wine, commanded that the vessels of the gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, and that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. You pick up on something here? First off, I already said it. What are you doing partying? By the way, Belshazzar was a good general. Historians, they'll tell you, he He was a soldier. He was a terrible politician. And that led to the crumbling of the spiritual structure and the religious structure within Babylon. Because you had Marduk was one god of the priests that lived there in Babylon, and that political power is kind of like the Sadducees and Pharisees. Well, they were pushing and minimizing them and trying to elevate the god of the sun, moon god, and it was causing this hatred. And it was just, you could just see the kingdom is crumbling underneath him on top of the threat of Cyrus, and yet what's he doing? Is he out there commanding the troops to try to rebuff the invasion force? No, he's back partying. It's even worse. He's taking things that his father had pulled out of the temple in Jerusalem, the sacred items, and brings them in and makes them a part of this orgy. And that seems trivial, but I tell you, God doesn't think it is. Because how many times has God ever mentioned the dinnerware at a party or a banquet? You know, they bring out their best. No. Daniel is writing this, guided by the Holy Spirit, reminding that where did these come from? And he knows it. That's the arrogance. Belshazzar knows that those used to be sacred, and they were in a temple, and him and his delusion thinks that somehow he's going to be able to glorify his grandeur and showing his superiority over all the other god of these foreign nations. And it just, so here he is in the middle of this. So they brought in the golden vessels that had been breaking out of the temple and the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, the concubines drank for them. They drank the wine. They praised gods of the gold. Look at that. Of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. That's the things in which they would make their idols out of, the very material and the purpose of them, you see. Now compare them to the materials that were made for the articles that were serving in the temple, to the real God. See the conflict that God is, you talk about poking the bear, God, and getting ready to cause the wrath of God to come upon you. And then with your arrogance. And when this happens, in verse 6, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. He collapsed. It terrified. Again, remember I told you, this king was also a general. Sometimes we kind of forget about it, we focus on it, but he wasn't a scaredy cat. He was, and so this terrified him to see this hand. Now, you've heard the phrase, the writing on the wall. Can't you read the writing on the wall? We use that a lot. What does that mean? You better figure it out. It's there. Look at it. It's there. The handwriting's on the wall. There's your message. But he can't understand it. But it's enough to terrify him. And I think it would terrify us in a lot of ways. I mean, if we saw this disconnected hand writing something, I'd say, what's in my wine? But it causes a physical ailment to just overwhelm him. And then the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astronomers. And the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. By the way, while this party is happening, do you know what's happening on the outside of the walls of the city? Cyrus is knocking. Cyrus's army is in the process of diverting the river because Babylon was really invincible. It was a city that the way they flowed the river through, no army could get in. Once they sealed those gates, it would be over a year siege. They could not penetrate. So you know what good old Cyrus's army did? Because the water flowed under. So they diverted the water. in one night. That's how fast. Now, I don't know how fast you can dig and move a river, but there were thousands out there. How do you miss that? You talk about writing on the wall. What about the writing outside the wall, right? What are you doing? You know, what are your guards doing? How can you miss this? And by the way, this offer is only good for about 5 hours. You're going to get to wear the purple and the chain for about 5 hours, and then it's going to be done. This story doesn't even last a day. And so outside, quietly, the river's draining. And they're going to slide underneath and come through those walls under and open up the gates, and the Persians are going to pour through. But meanwhile, back in the party room, there's a message. There's a lesson to be taught. You know, God could have just kept quiet, right? I mean, they're already draining the river. They're going to be inside within about 4 or 5 hours. It's going to go the way God wants. What is the purpose of this? He's going to die. Belshazzar, I hate to be a spoiler, but spoiler alert, he's going to die. And so what's new? God has destroyed nations before and stuff like that, but there's something very powerful that God takes the time to take this hand and put a message on the wall. Because you see, it wasn't for him. Belshazzar's the dead man. He's dead. It doesn't matter. It's not going to change a thing. That message is for everybody in that room that's going to survive that night, but it's for you and me. And it's for leaders today, in the past, and in the future. That's what this is for. Because like I said, was not going to change the outcome. They were all going to die. They were going to be destroyed. So you notice another thing is very common as we've gone through these lessons that seem to happen, that whenever these leaders all of a sudden are perplexed and can't figure something out, what do? They call in the wisdom of their people. And they never give them a right answer, or they can't answer them. Right? I mean, word for word, you could almost take the exact same list of people. Nebuchadnezzar did the same thing. Darius did the same thing. Nobody can do it. Well, not Darius, because that was a little different story. But you see that it's the same thing. And that's what happens to leaders, is they fail to go to the right source to get wisdom. They go to the wisdom of the world. They look around at the philosophies, the astronomy, all the feel-good stuff, the surveys. They don't look at God's word to figure out the right answer. And it always seems to be the last choice, isn't it? It was the same with Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't until he was at the end of it. And the sad part is, Nebuchadnezzar knew about Daniel. He knew that he was the smartest guy. He made him the chief magician and astronomer. He was already in charge of all those guys. And he still called in all the idiots. Then he calls in Daniel, and Daniel is able to answer it. Doesn't that seem almost like, doesn't seem to change with people that are in leader? They become arrogant, they become proud, and then they seek out advice in all the wrong places. Sounds like a cowboy song, doesn't it? All the wrong places, you know? I mean, it's like, where are you looking? And this is where it becomes very powerful because, like I told you, he's going to remind Belshazzar, you knew this lesson. You've seen this. And so they can't answer him. Then he's greatly alarmed. King Belshazzar is greatly alarmed, and his color changed, his queen and his lords were perplexed. Everybody's confused. They don't know what's going on. The queen, because his words of the king and his lords came into the banquet hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. Why is it you ever thought about, I just thought of this. Why is it the queen in the party? You notice she's not there? I think she's the smartest person in the room right now. He's in there with his concubines, girlfriends, partying up, and the queen's off She comes in and she's alarmed too. She's like, whoa, get a grip on yourself. Don't lose it. And she's the one. In verse 11, she says, then there is a man in your kingdom, and wow, she even knows about Daniel. He's not a best kept secret. In whom the spirit of the holy gods in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, in whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation. That you know this. Now, she's reminding him of this person as if he's oblivious, but we're going to find out a little later on that he knew too. But look how she is so articulate about the details about this Daniel. And by the way, Daniel, by this time, is pushing 80 years old. Yeah, from age 15. Poor Daniel's never going to get to go home to Jerusalem. He's probably at the age where he's like, just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. Now, I'll defend the fact that maybe they didn't bring him in because he's retired. But the point is, he is very well known, and again, the source is last. So Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, that the light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. So he's saying, you're that guy. So it's like, I do understand. Yeah, you are. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have chain of gold around your neck and be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said to the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretations. Daniel might have known, that necklace is only going to be on my neck for another 5 hours. I don't know. But you notice he's like, give your stuff to somebody else. That's not what's important. See, that's the other thing. The concept of lobbyists in the government is that they go and lobby and they give little fringe benefits, and we've tried to legally control it so that they don't have undue influence to cause somebody to change their decision. It's almost like this is what he's doing. He goes, look, you give me the answer and I'm going to give you all this glory. And he's like, you notice I said about the third ruler? This helps support what I was saying earlier, that he is not, his dad's the king. He's second ruler. And then he's trying to say, well, then I'm going to make the next person the third ruler. Just tell me what it is. Now listen to what Daniel says. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, language trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast. And his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind, listen to this, and sets over it whom he will. Don't forget that part. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of the house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines that have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver, gold, and of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose all your ways you have not honored. Notice the detail that Daniel knows about everything that happened. He just got brought in. Do you think they went through and explained to him? Now, maybe he looked around, but now remember, he was 15 when he left. He may know that those are in stories somewhere, but he wasn't a priest. He wasn't being trained even when he was young. They believe he was royalty, more of the kingly line. But look at the detail and how he goes through and says exactly what they had done and brings out the arrogance and the idea that they're worshiping the creature and not the creator. That's exactly what Paul said. Paul said that's why God gives people up. They start worshiping the creature and not the creator. Doesn't that sound like evolution? Just saying. Worship the creature and not who created it. And he said, because of that, then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. So he's telling him what the writing is. Mene, Tekel, and Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Presse, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And by the way, you got about 5 hours, maybe at best, and you're going to die. I mean, that's how rapidly. That's why I said, you know what, this is such a powerful message, because he's not going to live much longer. The message is much broader to leaders in the future and to all of us, as us who are not going to be world leaders, to understand the relationship that God has with world leaders. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Right after that, judgment comes. Now, you may say, well, that's Darius. That's not Cyrus. Cyrus doesn't arrive for another 6 months. And if you look at the way he is still the overall emperor of the entire Persian area, we saw this Darius is the same Darius that threw Daniel into the lion's den. And this is an appointed king that started to rule. But so it's not a conflict, like sometimes people try to say, oh, see there? He said it was going to be Cyrus. No, he's accurate. You know, that it was a Darius who took over and started ruling. Cyrus doesn't even come to town for another 6-8 months, but then he leaves and he puts him in charge. So it is historically correct. And both the Babylonian Chronicles and the Persian cuneiform talk about how that it really was a bloodless coup that they took over, except for Belshazzar and a few. It wasn't a massive battle, in other words. They slipped in so quietly and took them by surprise that it wasn't a bloody battle taking it over. But absolutely, it was Belshazzar's last night. So let's wrap this up and look at some of the lessons that we can see very clearly, and I hope to help us to understand, like I said, the bigger picture, and what he's trying to bring out to us. And the very first one of these great lessons is humility before God. Now, I don't care if you're a no person, you're just a ditch digger, or you're the Queen of England. You better be humble before God. And he does not tolerate it. We may think he's tolerating that arrogance, but he's not. And that's something that we see very loud in this message. The other thing is divine judgment. God has a judgment. And some of these judgments have already been laid out. And that's what's so powerful about reading and studying the minor prophets, like we're doing on Sunday afternoons. And if you're not able to be here, I understand, but they are online. You ought to go look at them, because that's one of the things. I sound like a broken record as I'm teaching it over and over and over and over and over again, because it seems to be the same message. One, God is in charge. God is not letting iniquity go by, and his judgments are sure, and they're going to happen, regardless of how fast we may want them, and we want to accelerate them. The next message is the brevity of earthly power. In all honesty, if you were to go back and look at the calendar of when nations rose and how long they ruled and stuff, I mean, outside of the Roman Empire, and now we don't have like the history of kings and empires in South America and all around the world per se, but it's still the same principle. You know, it's still those individual emperors of Rome. I think Augustus, the first one after Julius Caesar, was like the longest ruling emperor. And after that, you might go 20 years, 15 years. Now that seems like a long time because we have every 4 years an election, but that's nothing. That's nothing. And sometimes you'll see even in the Roman emperor succession, if you study that, which is fascinating, how fast some of those will go away and get killed by their own people because they're so evil. Evil checks itself sometimes. It's kind of ironic that even at the hand of evil, they will go and kill others. They will balance it out. That's what you start to see historically. And it's really God doing it. Remember, I told you about the Assyrians and how Habakkuk was so disgusted that God was going to use the Assyrians. And then God turned around and destroyed the Assyrians. And then God turned around and destroyed them by using the Babylonians. And then the Babylonians rose up and become what? What do we talk about? Proud and arrogant. And guess who he brought? He brought Cyrus, the Great. And what is so amazing is not only was he prophesied by name, but he did exactly what was not done by any previous emperor or conqueror. Is instead of assimilating and dragging the people off their land and relocating them, he set them free. He let Babylon go back and rule themselves. He let Assyria, the territories there, rule themselves. And he makes a proclamation and says, if you have been drug off your land, and you go home. And then Cyrus specifically, and this is written in world history too, he says to the Jews, take your articles from the temple, take the money and go back. Build the house of God. Build your temple. God is in charge. That's the biggest thing, you know. Earthly power, we think that these rulers are going to be forever. They're going to destroy everything, that it's all the end of time. But you know what? It's been worse. It really has. It has been a whole lot worse. The other lesson that I think is so powerful, and I think the last one, is respect for the sacred. Now that sounds very religious, but you know, what is the sacred? What does sanctified mean? It means set apart. So things that God has declared as set apart for himself is called sacred. Abraham was sacred because God said, you are special and I'm going to set you apart. And so what we learned, these may have been articles of temple worship and candles and vases and things like this. But it's not just that God looks at and says, I consider sacred. You, as a Christian, are sanctified, right? You are sacred to God, and he has not forgot about you. Let's flash back to the book of Acts, to a man who was being drilled and grilled and persecuted named Stephen. And he goes through and he gives them this meticulous history all the way back from Abraham, and he goes all the way through. And he preaches to them one of the best sermon you could imagine. I couldn't get away with preaching that long. And how did they respond? They were outraged. And they picked up stones and they started casting at Stephen and started to stone him to death. And Stephen looked up and he saw in the heaven clouds. And there was Jesus at the right hand of God standing. Every other picture that we have of Jesus in heaven is sitting in power, sitting in power next to the Father at the right hand. But when Stephen was being murdered because he was one of his sanctified ones, he was standing. He was standing. The angels rejoice at more than just us becoming a child of God. Heaven and all are far more involved than what we ever think about. When the world attacks us, they're attacking us, and we are sanctified. We are set apart. And it's not personal. It really is evil trying to destroy those sanctified people of God. And heaven doesn't let it go by. I mean, you go back to the Romans, they tried it, didn't they? They tried it time and time again to crucify, burn, have beasts tear Christians apart. Never, couldn't stop it. The kingdom continued to grow. And the Lord in the book in Revelations, you see the martyrs there, and God talking to the martyrs and comforting them and saying, a little while longer, you know what, hold on. He's not unaware of your plight. You are special to him. You are sanctified. So I hope that these lessons will help us to maybe reposition the way we feel about the things happening around us. One, individually, we need to stand strong like Meshach, Shadrach, and Daniel. We need to have that courage. Others need to see it. When you honestly look at a good Christian person versus somebody who is evil, wicked, and self-serving, it's a no-brainer. Whether they want to admit it or not, there's a difference. A Christian will always be the one that people will choose to be on their side and be their neighbor, right? Versus the axe murderer, the rapist, the evil person, the liar, the thief. Who wants him in your neighborhood? No, people want Christians around. And then we need to show them the way through our living, like Daniel did. And then that influences the world. And that's what gives the world an option besides the chaos and hatred that we're seeing going on around us. And we have to keep that compassion in our hearts and keep it in position that no matter what rages above us in authority, God's got that, okay? God's got that. If you're with us this morning and you're not a child of his, and I mean a child as far as being a Christian, one who proclaims that they are of God, that they have become a child of his the way that the Bible has taught us. That baptism, yes, itself is water. Peter says, you know what? It's not the washing away of filth that makes you better before God. But what an important symbol. Inseparable. You know that when you go down into that watery grave, Satan knows what you're showing. Do you realize this? The angels rejoice. But do you know what the demons are doing? They're trembling. Because you just mimicked what Christ did. Evil thought they were triumphant in murdering and killing the Son of God. That's what they heard from the Garden of Eden. They thought they won. The irony was they lost. And when he went into that grave and he preached to them basically what Peter said to those in prison, and basically said, look, I won. And the demons are sitting there going, he won. And guess what? You're going to stay here? I'm not. And he came back, didn't he? Guess what baptism shows the demons and proclaims to evil? That we too die with him. And we too will descend into that. But we will not stay there. We are going to rise and be victorious. And evil trembles at that thought. So maybe the water isn't saving you, but what a powerful declaration to the world and to Satan. And that's why it's so beautiful. And Paul said that's how we get into Christ. And if you haven't done that, I encourage you, I beseech you, I beg you to please join Christ in that watery grave and come up a new child. Be sanctified. Be a part of that heritage that we have, that we can look forward to, that's so blessed. And if we can help you in that journey, if you're a Christian and you're struggling, we're here for you too. We can pray for you. If there's any needs that we have, we're going to be singing this song. I hope that you will be sincere with yourself. This is your moment. I'm going to shut up. We're going to sing, and it's your time to get personal with yourself. I've been getting personal. Everybody says, you're a preacher, you get personal. Now, you know what? It's time for you to get personal with yourself and be honest. How are you in your relationship with God? And please do what you need to do to fix it. And if we can help you and you're comfortable, come forward while we stand and